This is the 2-year anniversary, actually, from when we first kicked off our inaugural event back in 2019. We also had Carlos Rivero speaking there, apparently having a much smaller, if not really any team, just being a solo chief data officer. And, you know, now he's grown and, you know, he's got all these wonderful people on his team and he's got all these initiatives his office has kicked off. And so today he'll be talking about, you know, all these accomplishments he's done during his time as CDO in Virginia. And I'm really looking forward to it. I love interacting with Carlos. He had me as a judge for the Datathon this year that his team basically ran. And yeah, I always feel like I learn something new whenever we brush shoulders. So yeah, take it away, man. I'm excited to hear this.
Awesome, Sam. Thanks a lot, man. Give me a thumbs up if you guys can hear me. Cool. All right. So, man, it has been a wild ride. 2 years ago when I gave this presentation, there was 4 major initiatives that we were working on. First and foremost was governance, right? Getting people involved in the data discussion, the data conversation, then discovery, but not just how do we make our data assets more discoverable, but also more understandable and accessible, right? And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. Trust, right? And so really to facilitate data sharing, you need trust. And, you know, in order to have that data sharing happen, you need to build relationships, and all relationships are based on trust. So not just trust in the emotional sense, but also trust in the legal sense. And so we developed the Commonwealth Data Trust to help support our data sharing capabilities. And then lastly, talent. How do we cultivate talent within the Commonwealth, data talent specifically, right? How do we build our data acumen within the Commonwealth? And so we focus on that initiative as well. And from these 4 initiatives, we've had a ton of different solutions, right? And we'll talk a lot about those solutions in a minute, but just to kind of give you guys a refresher of where governance sits within our data strategy, right? So when we talk about our overall data strategy, governance is the foundation of that data strategy, and the governance drives the architecture. And for those of you who weren't with us the last time we met 2 years ago, you know, architecture is the blueprint of how data flows within the organization, right? So how does data get from point A to point B throughout the organization? And this becomes incredibly important when you talk about data sharing. In order for you to share data, it has to move, has to go somewhere, right? Someone has to be able to use it. And so architecture plays a key role in our ability as an enterprise to make data assets accessible for sharing. So we'll talk a lot about more of that later, but ultimately the architecture guides management. When we talk about data management, we're really talking about the processes that govern the life cycle, the data life cycle, right? From collection and ingestion, analysis, processing, ultimately archival and disposal, right? How do we manage that data life cycle to ultimately support generating intelligence from those data assets? Now, ultimately, that intelligence helps inform the governance. So when we generate these intelligence products, usually that's where we identify the most glaring data quality issues, right? Now, we do have data quality checks, QA, QC checks all through this process, but you know, usually things slip through the cracks, right? And so when you have an intelligence products in front of you, that you are able to look at what are some of the data quality issues that kind of snuck through the QA, QC checks, right? And so when you look at those issues, that helps drive the governance, because in many cases, those issues arise from either lack of a policy standard best practice, right? So you need to create one that addresses that specific issue, or there is a policy standard best practice, it's just not being enforced, right? There's no compliance with that particular policy. And so there's a governance issue there where you have to monitor and enforce compliance. So being able to look at the overall data strategy in this context of how governance plays a key role, and now this is a virtuous cycle of continuous improvement, as I like to call it. Being able to feed back into the governance conversation and help continue evolving our architecture, management, and intelligence. So that's the premise of how we got from governance to integrate into all of these other capabilities, which ultimately derive the solutions that I'll be talking about next. But before we get there, right, what are our driving factors? Like, what are our forcing functions within this entire enterprise, right? Why do we do these things? Well, number one is to improve operational efficiency within every agency. Now, within the Commonwealth of Virginia, we have 63 executive branch agencies that fall under my purview. But in addition to that, we also have 133 localities that also fall within this overall governance scenario, right? So we need to be able to improve operational efficiency within all of those different organizations to help create more citizen-centered services, right? When we operate more efficiently, we can do more with less. And when we do more, we create more services for our constituents that ultimately should create better outcomes for them, right? And so there's a big distinction here between services and outcomes, right? Services are things that we as a government organization provide. Outcomes are things that our constituents experience. And so being able to link the two is one of the key components of this entire data strategy, is being able to look at across the Commonwealth, what are the different services that we're providing and how are they contributing to the outcomes that our constituents experience. Now, in order for us to do that, we need to share data, right? And so here's the use case or the value case for data sharing, right? Because when you talk about data, you're really talking about bits and bytes, you know, the binary representation of stuff that's happening out in the real world, right? Bits and bytes, zeros and ones that are in a digital system somewhere, whether that digital system is an Excel spreadsheet, a Google form, you know, a relational database, a graph database. It doesn't matter what kind of digital system it is, it's still a digital system, it's still ones and zeros, right? And so what we do is we collect data. And that data really doesn't change. For the most part, it's a snapshot of something that happened at some point in time, right? But then that data, when it's interpreted by an individual with a specific domain, from a specific background or perspective, then it becomes information, right? So the interpretation of that data becomes information. And that information is usually like patterns and trends that are discerned from the data assets themselves that kind of give you an idea of what's happening out in the real world. But it isn't until you start to understand the mechanics of this signal that you're seeing in the data that it doesn't become knowledge. So the assimilation of that information into the understanding of how that process is evolving in the real world, the mechanics of those processes, then it becomes knowledge. But that knowledge doesn't become intelligence until it's integrated into the decision-making framework, resulting in actionable decisions. So this is one vertical, right? When you share data, you create more of these verticals with every individual that you share with, because every individual is different. Everyone is going to come at the data with a different perspective, different background, different domain, right? And so whether this data was originally collected for criminal justice and it is now shared for health or environment or, you know, other types of domains and use cases, that then leads to more value from the data value chain, because then you create more opportunities for that data to evolve into information, knowledge, and intelligence. The data itself doesn't change, right? But it's the information that's generated from it, the knowledge that's generated, and ultimately the intelligence products that are generated that fuel the actionable decisions or create value for an organization. And so the more you share, the more value you create, which is why for us, you know, being able to increase the value of our data assets over time is the main reason why we really support data sharing, to create that connection between the different government services that we provide and the outcomes that our constituents are experiencing. Now, talking about data governance, you know, this is an amazing trip for us in the Commonwealth, because not only did we create the data governance framework that was recommended by the Data Sharing and Analytics Advisory Committee way back when we had that set up. It was created as an executive order 48 to be more specific in the Northern Administration, but it was also created legislatively the following year to give it more consistency and sustainability and continuity. So now the data governance framework that you see in front of you, with the Data Governance Council consisting of data owners from each of the different members of the Commonwealth Data Trust, to the executives that sit on the Executive Data Board, to those individuals that sit on the Virginia Data Advisory Commission, right? These organizations, these entities are now codified in the Virginia Code. And so that is a huge accomplishment for us to be able to say, hey, we now have a data governance framework that engages all of these different individuals within, or roles within, the data conversation in their respective place. And then the Office of Data Governance and Analytics, which is also created in code, now facilitates that conversation between each of these different components. And so when you talk about the Data Governance Council, you're really talking about the oversight of the Commonwealth Data Trust and how that Commonwealth Data Trust is operating, right? And identifying what policy standards and best practices need to be implemented and adopted by each of the different agencies to improve our data posture, right? But the Data Governance Council doesn't have the authority to implement and adopt and execute on those data policy standards and best practices. It's up to the Executive Data Board, those executives that oversee those individual agencies, to adopt and implement those policy standards and best practices. So that's why that communication is extraordinarily important, where the Data Governance Council identifies and recommends, but then the Executive Data Board adopts and implements, right? And then being able to have not just those two components at the operational level, but also the Virginia Data Advisory Commission, which consists of high-level state leadership, not just from the executive branch of government, but also from the legislative and judicial sides of the House, as well as 7 regional representatives across the Commonwealth that represent either a locality, an academic institution, or a technology partner within this space, right? So it's being able to bring all of these individuals and roles to the table to identify and include their perspectives on some of the data issues that we're experiencing, especially when we're talking about initiatives like substance use disorder, like infant and maternal health, like recidivism, right? These issues that we have to address, COVID-19, right? These issues that we have to address at the Commonwealth level, at the state level, are far-reaching and extraordinarily broad. No one agency has complete purview over the entire domain. So it's really the combination, the act of many agencies working together to address these complex issues that we really get the most value out of our investments, right? And so the Virginia Data Advisory Commission plays that role in helping to identify not just which issues we want to tackle, but which agencies need to be engaged in addressing those issues, and then advising the governor and the General Assembly as such. So we are very, very proud to have this data governance framework instantiated within the Commonwealth. Now, solutions, here's the fun part. I mean, for me, the people aspect of it is the fun part, because engaging with people is always dynamic and never predictable. But the solutions that we've created as a result of these initiatives are really phenomenal. When we talk about what solutions we're able to provide, all of the different state agencies across the Commonwealth, and even localities can participate in some of these solutions. It is mind-blowing for me. Number one is the Enterprise Data Catalog. We've created a process leveraging Microsoft Azure Data Catalog that allows an individual data steward within any of our organizations to log on to this cloud environment and register their data assets into the environment, right? And so when they register those data assets, that automatically creates a workflow, an item, a ticket in our backlog that says we have a new data asset to document. And then our, a metadata or our data curation lead goes in there, looks at the data asset, and then identifies which individual should be addressing that particular data asset, and then start working the documentation. And then through the process of documenting that data asset, that individual works with the subject matter experts and the data steward to really fill out the metadata. So really, the data steward's role is really not as, let me go ahead and do all this work myself, but it's really just register the asset, sit back, and then address and make connections between subject matter experts and themselves with the data documentation team to be able to support the metadata creation process, right? But then also to approve the metadata as it's being generated. So once the data documentation team completes their initial run of documenting the data set, then the data steward is then notified and it says, hey, you have a new data asset that's ready for your review. Go ahead and go to the data catalog, take a look at it, and then if you approve it, just tag it as approved. It automatically gets shifted over in our workflow, and then the data owner can then make the decision about whether or not to publish that data asset. And when a data owner tags a data asset in the data catalog as published, that means that they are now participating in the governance process, and they have determined that that data asset should be included in the Commonwealth Data Trust, right? So tagging a data asset as published in the data catalog connects that data asset into, or makes that data asset available through the Commonwealth Data Trust. So it's, again, the technology supporting the governance, which I think is critical. Now, in addition to making that data asset accessible or available through the Commonwealth Data Trust, when you tag a data set as published, it also becomes available in our metadata dictionary that's publicly accessible, right? And so if you go to metadata.cdo.virginia.gov, that's where you'll see all of the different data assets that have been tagged as published, right? And so we're working on improving that interface. Bear with us, but in the meantime, it's a back-end process that supports front-end access, right? So we're really excited about that. And ultimately, that's the way that organizations and individuals can identify data assets that they would like to have access to, specifically restricted use data assets, and then submit requests against those data assets through our DataSage platform, our secure analytics and governance environment. But before we get into DataSage, let's talk a little bit about the Commonwealth Data Trust. Now, I alluded to earlier when we talk about one of our initiatives, we talked about trust, right? Building trust, engendering trust amongst all the different individuals and organizations participating in data sharing. Well, the Commonwealth Data Trust is that legal framework that establishes and identifies the roles and responsibilities of each of the different entities involved in the data sharing relationship. Whether you are a data provider making data assets available through the trust, that means you're a data trust member, or you are a data trust user, a data recipient, right, receiving restricted use data from the trust, then you are responsible for signing an agreement, a contract, if you will, and responsibilities with regard to keeping those data assets confidential, secure, and private, right? That you have to safeguard access to those data assets as long as you're doing that project, right? Now, in addition to that, individuals that are working on that project for the data trust user, because remember, the data trust user is an organization, not an individual. The individuals that work for that organization that will have, like I say, hands on the keyboard, eyes on the data, they also have to sign the individual user non-disclosure agreement that certifies that personally certifies their understanding of their roles and responsibilities with regards to keeping this data secure, confidential, and private, right? So it's really a framework, if you will, of contracts that interact with each other that really kind of hone in on how this data sharing relationship needs to act. And so essentially what we've done is get rid of this one-to-one data sharing agreements that have been created that normally would take 6, 9, even 12 months to create, and created a standard agreement by which all agencies can leverage, and you don't have to create individual agreements anymore. And we'll talk a little bit about how that gave fruit when COVID-19 hit. And one of the things that I'd like to make a distinction of is, organizations not putting their data in the trust, they're making their data available through the trust. The trust isn't just one big bucket that a bunch of data goes into, right? It's really a mesh, a network, if you will, of data assets that are distributed across the Commonwealth that are made available through the Commonwealth Data Trust. And one important distinction that I like to make before I get into some of the different types of trusts that we had is that, just because you're a data trust member, that doesn't mean you have access to all data trust resources, right? A data trust member is just a person or an organization that's willing to make data available through the trust. That doesn't necessarily mean you get access to any data. In order for you to get access to data trust member contributed resources or data trust resources, you have to become a data trust user. So even though you're a member, if you want to use other organizations, other trust members' data, you still have to submit a data trust user agreement, and you have to certify that you understand your role and responsibilities with regard to keeping that data safe and secure, right? So having said that, we didn't just create the Commonwealth Data Trust out of thin air, right? We leveraged quite a few different learning experiences as we went along. So number one, VLDS, the Virginia Longitudinal Data System. This is the original data trust in the Commonwealth. Although they didn't call it a data trust, it acted as a data trust. It functioned as a data trust, right? And this has been in existence now for over 11 years. And it's managed by SHEV. So SHEV, the State Council for Higher Education in Virginia, is essentially the trustee of the VLDS data trust. So we learned a lot from our friends at SHEV and the VLDS folks working on their project. And what are some of the things what are some of the best practices that they thought were really influential in moving us forward? And what are some of the things that we needed to avoid? In addition to that, when we started our opioid pilot project, which ultimately became FACT, the Framework for Addiction Analysis and Community Transformation, one of the big hurdles we had to overcome is being able to integrate data assets from a wide variety of different community partners. So where VLDS is really talking about state agencies, FACT, and especially in the opioid pilot project, is really focused on community organizations, right? Community-based organizations, local organizations. And so we created a data trust for the opioid pilot project to test out some additional capabilities that we wanted to figure out how these things would work at a community level. And so the FACT data trust with all of the different local partners initially played a huge role in our ability to really understand and grow what the data trust model should look like. In addition to that, we also expanded with the workforce data trust. Now, this one was a little bit different because the previous ones were really more focused on, when you talk about VLDS, you're talking really about some serious lagging indicators, right? Data was really harvested for that system like twice a year, right? in the fact data trust, it was really weekly, maybe monthly. We were gunning for daily, and we're at daily now. But originally, we were happy with weekly, right? So weekly updates. With the workforce data trust, we're practically in real time, and being able to create interoperable connections between each of these different systems. So that added a whole new layer to some of the management and policies and standards and best practices that we needed to implement to help facilitate that engagement at the data trust concept. So all of these things really facilitated how we then ultimately created the Commonwealth Data Trust. So from these learning experiences, we worked with the Office of the Attorney General to craft what is now the Commonwealth Data Trust, right? These 4 agreements or 3 agreements in one amendment form that really completes the data trust agreement framework, right? And so as you can see, these are the organizations that are participating in the Commonwealth Data Trust. The important thing is not just that we have state agencies participating in this, including the Department of Health, Department of Emergency Management, but we also have 2 private organizations, right? The Virginia Association of Recovery Residences and the Virginia Hospital and Healthcare Association. Right? These are 2 private organizations that have been willing to join the data trust because of the nature of the legal framework that we've created and our ability to secure the data assets and use them for the purposes that we described and nothing beyond that, which is, I think, extraordinary. And when we talk about COVID, I'll give you a specific example of how VHHA was able to sign the data trust and move forward very quickly, and enabled us to mitigate the COVID-19 response. So earlier I alluded to the secure analytics and governance environment. This is the technical implementation of the data trust. You can access this environment by going to mydatasage.cdo.virginia.gov. This is the environment that allows you to go in and set up an account and identify your project, whatever project you want to implement with Commonwealth data resources, and then ultimately flesh out, who are your members, what is your project purpose, what are the goals and objectives of your project, what are the derived assets that you're going to create from Commonwealth restricted use data sets, who are your stakeholders, all this wonderful stuff, right? Being able to automate that process so that we can then send that request out to the appropriate data stewards based on the data assets that you've requested. So that's another capability that we've created that I've made available to the wider community to facilitate the data sharing process. Covered is our Commonwealth of Virginia Entity Resolution for Enterprise Data, right? And this is our internal, most secure environment where we do all of the entity resolution that supports between all the different data systems. So we bring in data assets from each of the different agencies that are participating in the trust at the individual level. We only use PI in this data, right? So what we do is we separate the data streams into 2. One is the data attributes that identify an individual, and the other data stream are the attributes that identify the government services that that individual is receiving. Right? So in one case, we have all the different services that a person is receiving without their identification. And in the other data set, we have their identification without any services that they're receiving. And within that PI data set, we're able to do entity resolution across multiple systems to create what we call the Universal Entity Index. And this index is a crosswalk table that allows us to make the connection for an individual record or an individual's record across multiple systems without having to use their PII. So once that information is loaded, once we create a universal identifier for that individual, and then in that Universal Entity Index, we create the local identifier, we document the local identifier for that same individual across multiple systems, we are then able to map that individual across all these different systems by only using the Universal Entity Index and no longer using their PII. So once that index is created and it's been updated, that PII is stored away and never to be seen again, right? Unless there's an update to it and then we update the Universal Entity Index. But essentially what we've done is separate all that out, keep the identifiable information completely hidden and away from any of the interactions that, when we support data sharing, we're supporting analytics, we're supporting all the intelligence products that we're creating. None of that has anything to do with the PI data. All of that is completely divorced from any attributes that identify the individual and only used attributes that identify the services that that individual has received, unless there is specific use case for that, which we'll talk about later when we talk about the vaccine administration. Another service that we've provided is Secure Connected Government Cloud. Originally, this was a cloud-based data sharing platform, secure data sharing platform, to be able to facilitate the sharing of restricted use data assets. But, again, it was originally for the framework for prediction analysis, community transformation, but ultimately we expanded it to support data sharing across the Commonwealth. So if you have a use case where an organization wants to have access to Commonwealth assets, and that access wants to be delivered through an API, and that Commonwealth organization doesn't have an API framework by which to make that data asset accessible, where they simply make it available to our Secure Connected Government Cloud. And on that cloud-based environment, we then leverage our API interface to make those data assets accessible to a wide community based on the authorization of the data custodian, right? The organization that owns those data sets. So ultimately, this is a fantastic capability that we've been able to leverage, not just for fact, but for other capabilities, including the COVID-19 response. Another capability that we created, and this was in partnership with the Center for Innovative Technology, our friends at Ripple, Research Improving People's Lives, and AWS through their workspaces capability, we created the Secure Data Enclave. So whenever we want to share restricted use data within an organization, one of the key components is proving that they are able to secure our data assets, right? Securely manage the data assets that we are providing. Well, in order for you to prove that to VITA, you have to have a SOC 2 level 2 audit, and then go through the whole VITA assessment process, which is not, a SOC 2 level 2 audit is not a cheap endeavor, right? It is something that costs quite a bit of money. And not only is the audit itself costly, but setting up the environment is extraordinarily, cost prohibitive as well. So if you're an organization, a nonprofit organization, an academic institution that really doesn't have the resources to establish your own secure environment, we've created the Secure Data Enclave that will facilitate that engagement. So organizations can procure Secure Data Enclave licenses from us, and then we will provide those licenses through our connection with the provider that will then give you access, because the Secure Data Enclave is VITA approved. It's been assessed and monitored by eVITA's Enterprise Cloud and Oversight Services, and we can make it accessible to support restricted use data assets on that platform. And the key component of the Secure Data Enclave is that it's completely locked down, right? Once you have a license to the environment, you have tools like R and Python, Power BI, things like that. But you can't even copy and paste out of that environment. The only data assets you connect to are the ones that we identify you can connect to in the Secure Connected Government Cloud. Or if you want to bring in your own data assets, then we can work with you to import those data assets into that licensed environment. But other than that, it's completely locked down. So that really gives us some assurance that the environments that you'll be using to access these data assets and analyze them and generate the intelligence that you want from them are completely secure, right? So, it gives us an additional way of making our data assets accessible, right? Because one of the biggest problems is like, well, okay, fine, I understand that your project is great, we want to support it, but you know what? You don't have a secure environment, so we can't give it to you. Right? We wanted to get rid of that excuse to not share data and create an environment by which an organization can procure these services from us at a very, cost-effective manner. In addition to that, we also have Covers, our Commonwealth of Virginia Enterprise Reporting Solution, right? This is a Power BI-based environment that we've stood up within the Office of Data Governance and Analytics that helps agencies and localities develop and deploy Power BI-based intelligence products into our environment for their production needs, right? Whether their needs have, involve public access anonymous users, or they have named users but still need to be public facing, or COV only internal users, right? We can support all three of those capabilities. And essentially what we do is we partner with these organizations, say, okay, you guys develop the solution. When you're ready to deploy it to our test environment, give us a deployment package. We will deploy it into our UAT environment. You guys then test it. When you're ready to promote it to production, let us know. We will then promote it to production on your behalf. And then you guys will then have your stakeholders access the intelligence products that you created. So the agencies themselves don't have to invest in the systems that support the infrastructure that supports these intelligence capabilities, nor do they have to invest in the personnel to manage the life cycle for deploying these into the production environment. We manage all of that for them. They simply have to work with us. Number one, they have to join the Commonwealth Data Trust, right? Because this is only available to Data Trust members, but also work with us to identify and develop their intelligence products, and then we deploy it on their behalf. So I think this is a fantastic capability and service that we're providing to Commonwealth agencies. And we have a few customers already. VEC, the Virginia Employment Commission, is one of our biggest customers right now, developing a lot of fraud detection analytics on this platform to support their internal agents, their investigators that are doing fraud investigations on an ongoing basis. So this has been a huge capability for VEC to deploy within their operational context. Virginia Open Data Portal. For those of you who have not been involved in any of our datathons are all powered by the Open Data Portal. And this is the landing spot for all open data assets within the Commonwealth of Virginia. So every organization within the Commonwealth that has a data asset that's accessible to the public or should be accessible to the public can use the Open Data Portal to publish those data assets. And that's data.virginia.gov if you don't know. Not only are all of those data assets accessible via API, but they're also accessible through stories and dashboards. You have the ability to create visualizations. So if you open up an instance of the Open Data Portal in your browser, you can go through, look at different data assets. You can filter data assets. You can create your own visualizations. You can create your own account and manage your own visualizations. So it's really an environment that supports quite a bit of capabilities, more than just, here's my data, download it, right? Way beyond that. And I'll talk a little bit in one of the products that were created by the Virginia State Police on their Open Data Portal that helped them meet an immediate need that they had earlier this year. So how it all comes together, how it all works, right? So I'm just gonna fly through this real quick, but essentially the role of my office, the role of the Chief Data Officer and the Office of Data Governance and Analytics is to connect data assets that you see down at the bottom, right? From each of the different agencies down at the bottom, and this is not an exhaustive list, it's just representative of all the different agencies within the Commonwealth of Virginia, make those data assets accessible to those stakeholders that you see at the very top, whether that stakeholder is another government agency, or it's a medical professional or a community leader or a member of the public. We want to be able to facilitate that transaction between our data owners and our data stakeholders at the top, right? And we do that through a wide variety of different mechanisms. Number one is open data, right? Leveraging our Open Data Portal through data.virginia.gov in our partnership with the Library of Virginia, who have always been extraordinarily awesome partners to work with. Right? But in addition to that, being able to document our data assets and make them not just discoverable, but understandable, right? That's the Commonwealth Data Trust, and then the Enterprise Data Catalog, where our data stewards register those data assets and student apprentices document those data assets. The data stewards then approve them, and then the data owners publish them to then make them available through Data Sage. Right? So that's our secure analytics and governance environment that makes these restricted use data assets accessible to our stakeholders, right? So where the Enterprise Data Catalog is focused on discoverability and understandability, if that's even a word, Data Sage is working on access, right? And then underpinning Data Sage is our PI matching environment that ultimately creates that anonymized universal entity index crosswalk table, which is our covered environment. And then lastly, we have our secure environment for data sharing, which includes our secure connected government cloud, which is based on the Socrata platform, but then also the secure data enclave. That is where organizations can acquire licenses to manage their own restricted environments. Moving on very quickly. And Sam, what's a time check, man? Because I want to make sure I'm not running out of time on you guys. Are we doing good?
Yeah, we're doing fine, man. It's 6:10, so
Okay, cool. Awesome. I will keep running through. So data literacy and talent. And as I mentioned earlier, that data talent is one of the major initiatives we also focus on as well. Right, being able to cultivate data acumen within the Commonwealth, and so we worked on 3 different initiatives to help with that. Actually 4, but I'll talk about the 4th one in companion to our apprenticeship program. So number 1 was we created a data governance course and added it to the Commonwealth of Virginia Learning Center. So this is an online self-paced learning module within the Commonwealth of Virginia learning system or learning center that's accessible to all state employees. But not only is it accessible to all state employees, it's also accessible to localities as well. And they don't necessarily have to be Virginia localities. If you're a public sector organization that wants to take a data governance course or wants your employees to take a data governance course, reach out to us and we can connect you with our learning center domain manager and they can give you access to the data governance course. Which I think is a fantastic thing for us to be able to, expand upon the understanding of what data governance actually is within a much larger context, right? Not within the data management context, but within the much larger context of data utilization. Then we also have the Rural IT Apprenticeship program that we created with the Southwest Virginia Higher Education Center, focused primarily on data documentation and visualization, but also data quality assessments. And that's a program that actually just recently got underway. And it's something that we've been working on for quite a while. And there's a partnership there with Radford University, which I'll talk a little bit about later, that we developed additional online self-paced competency-based data courses that anyone can take through their respective employers. So we're really excited about that. And also the Commonwealth Data Internship Program, helping to facilitate interactions between our executive branch agencies and different academic institutions. Now, obviously, all of these things have not been without hiccups. They haven't all worked flawlessly. There's still quite a bit of learning and building and opportunities for improvement. But, we've really been able to work on a lot of these different things at the same time and bring people to bear on some of the problems that we've been having with our data assets and making better use of the data assets to make better informed data-driven decisions within the Commonwealth. So the data governance course, let's talk a little bit about it. It's a 5-module course within the Commonwealth Virginia Learning Center, and it goes through a wide variety of different data governance topics. But most importantly, it talks about the data governance framework, right, within the Commonwealth of Virginia. Right? What is the framework? Who are the members of the different entities? What are the data lifecycle steps? What are the different types of data that you have? What defines a golden record? What are some data privacy laws and policies? What are the roles of different individuals within the data process, right? Whether you're a data owner, you're a data steward, a data custodian, or even a data curator, everyone plays a specific role. And how do we get everyone to understand their particular roles within the larger context? So it's been live since June of 2020. And since then, over 200 state employees have accessed the course. Now, one of the things that we realized is that although, over 200 have accessed the course, not everyone has completed it. And so one of the things I think we need to do is really break the course down into like 30-minute segments. Because I think right now the course is like 4 hours long, right? And so for someone within state government to actually dedicate 4 hours of their life to really sit through and do a whole course like this, I mean, I'm excited about it. I did it. I know a lot of data professionals would do it, but in order to really appeal to the larger community, we need to make some changes. And so those are the things that we're working on is being able to how do we break the course down into 30-minute chunks that people can easily digest, and then be able to get more individuals finishing the course, not just starting it. But we're excited that they at least started and worked towards it. So, and then we're also excited that quite a few people did finish it. So it's not like nobody finished it. Quite a few did, and so we're very happy about that. But some of the agencies that have had employees participating in the course include the Department of Corrections, Department of Juvenile Justice, Department of Taxation and Motor Vehicles. I mean, these are some of the organizations that have the most important data assets within the Commonwealth to serve our public, right? I mean, corrections, obviously, juvenile justice, right? Two major organizations that provide quite a few services to our most vulnerable populations. So being able to work and see that those organizations have expressed interest and have had employees taking the data governance course is very heartening for me to see that. I'm very happy about that. So this is what the course looks like. It has 5 different modules. Those talk to a lot about different data governance from a governance perspective. Talks about the data lifecycle. What is data governance? This is how many people have started and completed. So you see there have been quite a few that have completed, but there's still quite more that have not. And so being able to look at why, and we have reached out to those individuals that have not completed it, and got some feedback on it, and starting to make improvements to the course so that we can get more completion. The Rural IT Apprenticeship Program, and this again was with a partnership with the Southwest Virginia Higher Education Center and our formerly Chief Workforce Advisor to the Governor, now Secretary of Labor, Megan Healy. So, working with them to identify opportunities for individuals in the rural communities to participate in the data documentation process. So while they're working on data documentation for us, not only are they learning about data and building up their data acumen and building up their data technology skills, but they're also learning the business of government. By working with subject matter experts, they're understanding what are the business processes that are generating these data assets that they're seeing, right? The metadata that they're seeing, how those business processes generate those different data or operate within the context of those data that they're helping to document. So it's a two-pronged, education here, but it's also leveraging our partnership with Radford University, which is the next one. Yes, Radford University, which they have a online self-paced competency-based program in both cybersecurity and geospatial intelligence that we were able to leverage and create 2 additional courses in data documentation and curation, as well as data quality and visualization, that really kind of rounds out the entire program. So, for these individuals that are participating in the Rural IT Apprenticeship Program and doing data documentation work for us, not only are they, obviously get access to the data governance course, but they also get access to the Introduction to Geospatial Data and Technology, Foundations in Cybersecurity, Data and Web Security, and also the other 2 courses that I just mentioned, right? And so it's being able to provide them with additional information and knowledge about, not just how to document data, but how data plays in each of these different domains, which I think is incredibly important. Lastly, in the data talent pipeline sector, we have the Commonwealth Data Internship Program. Now, again, this is one of those programs that was originally created back in 2015, and it's operated out of VITA, Virginia Information Technologies Agency, through their VITA Innovation Program. So we partnered with them to help make connections with different agencies to get them to not just agencies, but also with academic institutions to get students involved in some of the data work that we need to get done within the Commonwealth. So not only do the students get to work on professional level projects that help them to build up their marketability and their competencies, but the agencies also get the talent and the tools that these students come with to be able to address some of their significant data problems. So we think it's a great matchmaking service that we help provide, but it's a lot of work, right, to be able to facilitate those transactions, but we're happy to do it. Virginia Datathons. So a big part of our outreach effort, also to promote our open data portal, is the Virginia Datathon. And so in 2016, we had our first Datathon, which was the New Virginia Economy. And then in 2017, it was focused on opioid addiction. In 2018, which is when I joined the Commonwealth, I joined in August, and I wanted to have it in October, and it wasn't enough time to really do it. So we postponed it to March or April. And we had the Equity in Education Datathon in 2019. In 2020 was our first virtual Datathon because of obviously COVID. And so we focused ours on communities and COVID-19 and how different communities were impacted by the pandemic. And when we talk about communities, we're not just talking about geographic communities, but we're also talking about socioeconomic communities as well, demographic communities, different groups of people, right? How different groups of people, regardless of how they're connected, are affected differently by COVID-19. And then this year, we just had last month our 2021 Datathon focused on food insecurity. And that was generated by interest from the governor's children's cabinet and their interest in an initiative called the Roadmap to End Hunger. And so when they reached out to us to implement the Roadmap to End Hunger dashboards, I thought it'd be a great opportunity for us to develop the Datathon around food insecurity and have multiple teams working on the food insecurity or the Roadmap to End Hunger capabilities with different data. I mean, this was our biggest Datathon to date. We had 26 teams participating. We had 9 teams on the waiting list. And the only reason we couldn't add those 9 teams to the Datathon was because we did not have enough time blocked off for presentations. Every presentation was 5 minutes from each of the different teams. And so if we added those 9 additional teams, that'd be an additional 45 minutes added to our event, which, you know, it would have taken us way beyond 6 p.m. on the Friday afternoon or evening. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted to be considerate of people's time. And so, you know, we're very excited to see how much the Datathon has grown, and we love to see it grow even further. So how did data deliver results? Some key examples of what we've been working on. So obviously I mentioned FACT and the opioid pilot project, right? So, you know, in Winchester community in 2019, from Q1 to Q4, overdoses went from 31% down to 15% for that quarter, right? Which is significant. And then we also were able to identify a case where within a given month, you know, they had a huge spike in overdose deaths. And then because of the data that we were able to bring together, make available to not just the health practitioners, but also the law enforcement individuals and the community organizations, they were able to bring the number of overdose deaths to 0 the following month, because they found that the deaths were due to the heroin being laced with fentanyl. And it was all hands on deck with regards to not just from the law enforcement perspective to you go and find where this fentanyl was coming from and where this heroin that was laced with fentanyl was coming from, but also community outreach to let the whole community know that, you know, there's bad batches of heroin out there, stay away from it, you know, save people's lives, right? And also from the health services perspective. So being able to facilitate and empower individuals within a community to make the best informed actions for themselves help to bring those deaths down to 0 for the following month, and I think the month after that as well. Some of the things that we looked at from the Fact Intelligence platform is the age of first use versus the age of first interaction with law enforcement. And this kind of gives us a metric of societal impact of each of the different substances that are being monitored in this system. And so when you look at the age of first use to the age of first interaction with law enforcement, you know, different substances have different metrics, right? Different values. And so when you look at alcohol, for example, that is about 40 years. When you look at marijuana, it's about 23 years. When you look at cocaine, it's down to 16 years. And when you look at fentanyl, it's 6 years, right? So depending on the different substance that the individual is using or has used, that substance is going to have a different intensity associated with it with regards to its societal impact. And so we're looking, as we expand FACT across the state, we're looking to see if these patterns hold. Also, the workforce data trust and the referral portal. So as I mentioned earlier, you know, that whole interoperability capability between the different systems to support the workforce data trust couldn't have come at a better time. And the workforce data trust and the referral portal is essentially the online version of when an individual goes to a career services center to receive these workforce services from the state government, right? And so when COVID pandemic started, all of those service centers were shut down. And so as we all can remember, especially at the very beginning of the pandemic, a lot of organizations, especially food service establishments, were laying off quite a few people. How were those individuals going to go and get workforce services if the service centers were closed down? And so that's where we accelerated the deployment of the referral portal to make that online portal accessible to the wider community. Now, it isn't just an online portal to register and get access to these services, but it also shifts the dynamic between the requester and the provider. So historically, when an individual would come into a career service center and they would request these workforce services, depending on who you would ask, they may give you the full menu option of, you know, everything that's available, or they may just simply say, yeah, this is what you're looking for, here, go talk to that person, right? They'll give you somebody's card, they will give you a referral, and it would be up to you to go and contact that individual and make that connection. Well, the workforce referral portal works completely different, where when you log on to the referral portal, you self-identify what are the things you're looking for, what are the barriers that you have to employment, what are some of the issues that you're experiencing, and then through that process, we identify all of the different services that you're eligible to receive from the state government, and then we provide you with a menu option of all the different things that you determination as to what you want to follow through with. So you can check off all the things that you want to continue to have a referral for, and then we create an account for you in each of those different systems. So no longer do you have to contact someone and have them create an account for you. The system itself creates an account in each of the different systems. So it reaches out to the Virginia Employment Commission system, to the DAR system, to the Virginia Community College system, whatever system you are eligible for to participate, you elected to receive a referral for, it creates an account in that system. And then it puts the onus on the provider to contact you, the requester. So no longer are you, the requester, forced to chase people around. Now we are sending out that referral to that organization, and now they are responsible for communicating and contacting you and engaging with you in a timely manner. And we're managing those metrics. We're keeping track of those performance metrics to determine how many people from which organizations, from which socioeconomic, demographic groups are requesting, certain services with certain, obstacles and then or barriers, and then which organizations are providing the timely service that we're expecting. And if they're not providing timely service, why are they not providing that service? Right. So it really changes the dynamic from a requester-driven model to a provider-responsive model, which I think is fantastic. And that couldn't have come at a better time, especially with the COVID pandemic as it hit us in March. So we were hit with COVID, started in March, and I think this thing launched in late April, early May. But it was originally slated to launch in July. So we had to accelerate that, the launching of that. So not only is the referral portal a user accessible capability, but there's also all of the performance management dashboards that I alluded to earlier, that we're managing all those metrics and keeping track of which providers, which centers, which organizations, which individuals are providing the services that we want them to provide and which ones are not, and how do we mitigate that. And then COVID-19 response. I mean, as you all remember, and obviously we're still in the COVID-19 response, so it's not like it's completely over, but this thing hit us pretty hard, right? And initially there was a lot of talk about standing up alternate care facilities, right? Because we did not know what the demand on our hospital and healthcare system was going to be, and whether or not those organizations were going to be overwhelmed with COVID cases. And so one of the things that we did was reached out to the Virginia Hospital and Healthcare Association. I mean, mind you, there was over 135 different hospitals and healthcare systems in the Commonwealth, right? Having a data sharing agreement with each one would take forever, right? But fortunately, we had VHHA, the Virginia Hospital and Healthcare Association. It's a member-driven private association of all of these different providers that we were able to work with. But obviously, they weren't willing to just give up the data, right? We needed to make sure that we created that trust with them that facilitated that transaction. So in order for them to provide the number of beds, the number of ventilators, the number of ICU patients that were attributable to COVID-19 and how many they had and what was their surge capacity and all that wonderful stuff to allow us to determine whether or not we had to stand up alternate care facilities and where, they needed to become a member of the data trust. And fortunately, we had just wrapped up our agreements with the Office of the Attorney General. And so we were able to hand these agreements, the data trust member agreement, over to the VHHA and had their attorneys look at it. And within five to 6 hours, they returned the data trust member agreement signed. The following day, the data started to flow. And 6 days later, that data was on this dashboard in front of the governor and his executive team. And they were able to determine from the data that you're seeing now that they did not need to establish alternate care facilities. And so as a result, we shifted our focus, not just our financial resources, but also our attention, energy, and human resources to testing and do widespread testing across the Commonwealth. And so we looked at not just lab testing performance, but we're looking at the testing capacity across the Commonwealth, but we're also looking at testing coverage, right? Where are we doing testing and where are we not doing testing? And this was down to the zip code level, right? So we're able to tell the 35 different health districts which of their localities were performing or not performing according to our state testing requirements and goals. And so early on, we set a testing requirement that 2% of your population needed to be tested every month, and 4% tested every month was the goal, right? And so how many localities met the requirement, how many localities met the goal, how many localities were above the goal for every health district. And so what this tool allowed a health district director to do is look at their specific health district, look at the localities within their health district to determine which ones were not performing according to our needs, and then get on their case, right? Identify what do they need to make sure that their constituents were being tested accordingly, right? And ultimately that gave us a really clear picture of where the cases were occurring. So much so that, I don't know if you guys remember, but back in July, when the cases in the Hampton Roads area were starting to go up, that percent positive rate was going up to 12%, 13%, that the governor locked down that region and that region only and left the rest of the state alone, because the rest of the state was below 9% positive, right? So being able to make those precise policies that engage a very specific subset of our population to mitigate a very specific issue was one of the key capabilities that we were able to derive from having this data flowing within the entire environment. But we also were able to identify long-term care facilities and issues with some of our long-term care facilities. And some of you may not remember, but early on, many of our long-term care facilities were, highly susceptible to COVID outbreaks. And so being able to look at the 400 and plus different long-term care facilities within the Commonwealth and identify which ones are having outbreaks and what were the things that they needed most. Was it PPEs? Did they need ventilators? Things of that nature was key to our ability to respond to the COVID pandemic. Ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, we had a health district dashboard. We created one specifically for our health district directors that allowed them to identify where testing was occurring within each of their different localities and which localities were meeting the requirements and meeting the goals, right? And as you can see down at the bottom where you can see the different localities identified, most of them are yes. And there's one where they're, sometimes the number of the records that we were receiving from the labs did not resolve to a particular locality. Sometimes these were, locations that were identified outside of Virginia that were not associated with anything, right? So it's a data quality issue, but obviously those were not meeting the goals. But in a health district perspective, if they were to look at their particular health district, they would see only their locality show up and then very quickly be able to determine which of the localities are performing or not performing. And that played a key role in our vaccine administration. So when we first started with our vaccine administration, 35 different health districts created 90 different data systems to collect exactly the same information. Pre-registrations from individuals that were vulnerable and needed to have access to the vaccine as early as possible, right? And so, that became a nightmare. And so the result was that we integrated 1.8 million records, pare that down to 1.2 million unique individuals over a weekend to then begin what we called the statewide pre-registration system, which became vaccinate.virginia.gov. So that ultimately created the system that we have now, which is 5.4, now it's well over 5.5 million unique individuals in the pre-registration, vaccine notification, and administration data set. So we combined the entire journey from pre-registration to vaccine administration in this one system, so we can capture all of that, all of the individuals that needed to be vaccinated sooner rather than later, right? Because they have pre-existing conditions, they were, in an occupation that exposed them, had a higher risk of exposure to COVID-19, all of these different factors. And essentially what you see is a graphical query tool that we created for all of the different health district personnel, which there's 35 different health districts. This thing was accessible by over 230 different individuals that allowed them to query the 5+ million records across 34 different parameters to help hone in or zoom in on a specific subset of the population that they wanted to reach out and schedule for an appointment. So if you were in a long-term care facility, or you worked in a hospital, or you were in law enforcement, or you were in phase 1 or phase 2B or phase 2C, they could pick who they wanted to set up a clinic for, identify those individuals that belonged in their localities, and then contact those individuals to get them to register for a vaccination clinic, right? So this really facilitated and accelerated our ability to get vaccines into the arms of the individuals that needed it the most. But in addition to the health districts, our localities also leveraged our data assets, not just from the dashboard perspective, but also tapping into our restricted use data sets through our APIs to create their own intelligence products. And here, the Civic Lab in Norfolk created their own community-based models that allowed them to identify which communities were not being served by the vaccination clinics, and help them to identify mitigation strategies that they would have to employ to address the needs of each of these different communities. So it's not just about us being able to leverage this data at the state level, but also facilitating the derivation of intelligence at all the different localities across the Commonwealth, because we're making this data accessible from an API-based environment. I mentioned a little while ago about the Virginia State Police leveraging our open data portal to create their Virginia Community Policing page. And so, they turned to us and said, hey, we have this need. The General Assembly in the special session said that by July 1st, we needed to have this, these data assets made available to the public. We don't even know where to begin. And so we work with them to identify, well, what data assets are you talking about? Are they meant to be open? If they are, okay, well, here's our open data portal. And we work with them to get them up to speed on how to leverage the open data portal to make these data assets accessible. So as a result, they were able to go in and create an interactive site on our data.virginia.gov. So if you go to data.virginia.gov, you go to other resources and go to the agency page and find Virginia State Police, you'll see their story page for this, which has not just this visualization, but a wide variety of other visualizations that allow individuals to interact with the data and then ultimately download those data sets. So while they had a deadline that only gave them 2 months to implement the solution, because we were able to give them access to the open data portal and give them the tools that they needed and the tutoring that they needed, they were able to get this done in 2 weeks. So I think it's a huge win for the Commonwealth to be able to turn something like this around very quickly. We were also approached by the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer to build out the health equity dashboards, which leverages our data intelligence as a solution, our COVERS platform, the Commonwealth of Virginia Enterprise Reporting System. And so having utilized that system, we were able to very quickly create a wide variety of different public-facing dashboards that are going to be posted on the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer's website very soon. So this is one of those things that we're able to really support a lot of the intelligence capabilities or intelligence needs of the Commonwealth through having the Office of Data Governance and Analytics. Lastly, the roadmap to end hunger. As I mentioned earlier, the Governor's Children's Cabinet reached out to us with the roadmap to end hunger initiative. And really what they were looking for is a dashboard. And well, really what you want is the open data portal to bring all these different data assets together and then make them accessible to the wider community. So not just you're creating dashboards, but you're making this data assets accessible so that folks can better gauge how we're doing in the roadmap to end hunger, but also to be more transparent with our capabilities and be able to leverage the Datathon to have different teams create different solutions. And so on that note, 26, I think there's 24 because I think 2 teams dropped out by the end. But if you want to go to the Library of Virginia's YouTube channel, there you can see all of the 2021 Virginia Datathon presentations, where each of the different teams created their own unique solutions to help address hunger within the Commonwealth from the 20+ different data sets that we had available on the open data portal for food insecurity. And lastly, the Virginia Department of Emergency Management has also been working with us on their payroll automation project, which is just a data transformation project. No cool or sexy intelligence products out of this, but really just kind of helping them automate a process that was really human intensive and prone to error, and really just get them to facilitate those data transactions. And so just becoming, providing services that the government needs, right, is really one of the big things for the Office of Data Governance and Analytics. Lastly, I talked about the Virginia Employment Commission with their fraud detection analytics, leveraging our Commonwealth of Virginia enterprise reporting services. So, this is an example of some of the dashboards that they've created for their internal investigators to look at, potential cases of fraud. So this is some employee feedback that we received. Not going to bore you with that. This is the Office of Data Governance and Analytics as it exists today. So this is, I think my biggest accomplishment, right? Is being able to have an Office of Data Governance and Analytics that has not just the Chief Data Officer, but also a Deputy Chief Data Officer that's a classified employee, a Communications Outreach Engagement Manager that's also a classified employee, because if you don't tell the world what you're doing, nobody's going to know, right? And so we absolutely have to have a good communications arm for the Office of Data Governance and Analytics. And within each of those different operational capabilities and communications, we have a variety of different staff that are working on a contract basis, right? So we have contractors that are working for us in each of these different capabilities. So I think this, as far as I'm concerned, is the greatest accomplishment to date for us, is to have the Office of Data Governance and Analytics. So if you haven't already, please sign up for our newsletter, Bits and Bytes, at the cdo.virginia.gov site. And on that note, thank you very much, and happy to take questions.
Thanks so much, Carlos. Anyone have any questions?
I've got one, I'll go. Hi, my name's Anna. I actually work with DGS. I was interested in hearing about your Data Governance Council. Is there any criteria or requirements to be part of that?
Yeah, just have to be a Data Trust member.
Okay, so then our data would be, I think we got started on that path, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, and so being a Data Trust member, if your data is in the Open Data Portal or you're making it available through the Restricted Use Access, doesn't matter. You are a member of the Governance Council and the Executive Data Board. So at that point, we just have to identify on which one, right? So your executive would designate someone to sit on the Executive Data Board, and then they would also designate someone to sit on the Data Governance Council.
Okay, thanks.
Cool.
That was very interesting.
Thank you, Bobby.
Okay. Bye.
So I'm curious, Carlos, you've mentioned so many accomplishments throughout, like, the last couple of years. What would you say is probably the most challenging thing you had to tackle as a CDO?
People.
All right, I'm thinking of if you think of Carlos's worst moment from the summer. I can think of it clearly when I was on my last project. But you're a initiative that just was
my worst moment of the summer was being and I might get in trouble for saying this, but getting in between the health districts and VDH. It's almost like a marriage counselor, right? Where these two people are in a relationship and they hate each other, but they have to be in this relationship because they feel like they have no other choice, right? And you're coming into this thing trying to say, hey, we can help you guys. Health districts, we understand you guys need, we can help you. No, we don't believe you. You people suck. You've never delivered on a promise, that you've ever made. That was, dude, that nearly broke me, man. It was incredibly difficult to work with 200 and plus different stakeholders in the thick of a crisis, that were all wanting different things, all wanting to reprioritize the work that you're doing, when you're wrangling, data from 90 different systems and trying to homogenize it and make it all uniform and make it all stick while building the state registration system that ultimately is going to feed into this and the full data pipeline that does all the matching. I mean, think about your most complex data project and then throw 200 plus screaming people into that mix every day, right? That was, I think, the most challenging time that I had over the past 3 years.
Dude, that's actually, I was not expecting that. I mean, that sounds, I can barely manage like the 10 folks I interact with and getting everyone on the same page. I mean, what's the secret to that? They're all in Virginia, so I guess time zones are probably not an issue, right? But
say that last part again, Sam. It broke out on me.
no worries. I'm just curious to know what the secret sauce is to that, because I guess if they're all in Virginia, time zones may not be an issue, but it
Oh,
sounds
that's not true. So the development team that we had working on the state registration system, with they were some part of them were offshore. So we definitely had some time zone issues and some communication issues. But I mean, compassion, played a huge role. Being able to understand where these individuals are coming from, the history of their relationship between the health districts and central office. The context of building relationships, right? Being able to, even though you're in this high pressure, there's a lot of anger. You're on the same team and you're trying to accomplish for our constituents, right? And so having that in mind and that, front and center really kind of helped to make it a little bit more tolerable, right? And I wouldn't say it was easy, because it was not easy. And my wife can attest to like all the times that I was like, worked through it. We figured it out. And
hey man, you cut out for a bit, like the last like 5-10 seconds or so. But it sounds like you said you worked it out, and I mean, it was, there was a resolution in the end. Wow, man. I can't imagine your job is easy.
no, it is not easy, man. And and the funny thing is that a lot of organizations think that you just hire a CDO and all your problems are solved. Like, and that's not true. Like that you're so far from, right? And really it's, you have to build up the support team and structure to make that go, right? And fortunately, when I first started, I did a lot of relationship building, and I turned off my camera so I can conserve bandwidth and make sure that you guys can hear me good.
Cool.
Building those relationships, I think, is the most important thing a CDO can do, right? Because ultimately, it's the relationships that help move the organization forward, right? It's not technology, right? Technology is great, and we all love it, but it's tools, right? It's a hammer, right? You're not going to use a hammer to fix a kitchen sink, right? You're going to have to use the tools appropriate for the problem at hand. But really, the biggest problem that we have is getting people engaged in the process. And when we talk about people, we're not talking about technologists. We're not talking about IT folks, right? We're talking about business people, right? How do we get the business side engaged in the data conversation? And that's a lot of what I did early on, not just at the state executive level, but also with our legislators, also with our academic institutions, also with our localities, right? Really reaching out to these organizations and finding out what are their pain points and what are the things that I need to focus on to help make their lives better, right? And that's essentially what I did, right? And building those relationships and then coming through with the things that I promised, right? He's like, well, these are the things that I'm going to create. And I don't know if you remember way back when, Sam, but all this stuff is not new. Like all these things I said 3 years ago, I was going to create. And a lot of people looked at me and thought maybe I was crazy or whatever. But here we are 3 years later, and they all exist. Okay?
Here we are. Yes, sir.
So here we are. And so our legislators have been extraordinarily supportive, because I have done the work of reaching out to them and working with them and identifying what their pain points are and helping to resolve some of the issues that they've had. So it's been a lot of work. And like I said, a lot of relationship building, but I think it's bared a lot of fruit.
Dude, that is awesome to hear, man. I mean, it sounds like, yeah, exactly that. I mean, your hard work is paying off. And when we look back like 2 years ago, yeah, it's cool to see some of this stuff come to life. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm speaking for Brandon and the other organizers here, and any OGs that were here, that are here tonight, that were here watching your presentation 2 years ago. So yeah, it's a good feeling, man. You should be proud.
Yeah, I am, man. I am. I am extraordinarily proud of what we've been able to accomplish here in the Commonwealth. And I mean, to be perfectly honest, I don't keep track of these things. I don't gauge how we do against other states because I'm really so focused on the work that we're doing that I don't have time to look out. But I can honestly tell you that Virginia is now a leader in this space. And that wasn't true when we got here, right? I mean, when I got here, it was non-existent, right? Our data posture was absolutely non-existent, especially at the national level. And now, because of everything we've accomplished and all the work that we've done, and we are a leader, and that's extraordinary, and
Yeah.
I'm really, really proud of that.
Yeah, that's a good feeling, man. That's actually really cool to hear. Not even considering how other states probably have CDOs too. That it's dude, it's a big system, man. It's pretty cool to hear that though. That Virginia's leading, now, and I guess in our whole data systems and stuff, and how everything's integrated and talking, and we got data governance and dope CDO. Yeah.
I think Mason has a question.
All right.
Yeah, just in this discussion, I know it might be, off base or off topic or something, but I just kind of feel like I'm taking a step back for some of these things. And I remember some months ago hearing Noah Yuval Harari talking about tools for democracy and empowering individuals and that sort of stuff. And I think back to about a year ago when, COVID-wise was, implemented, and it doesn't seem like much really came of that. I'm not sure if that's really in your, area or not, but I was kind of wondering why that seemed like it was, giving information to individuals, and didn't see any ads for it. Saw it mentioned in a few speeches, but the result I saw is the people who could work from home and isolate anyway were very strong overlap, very circular Venn diagram between them and people who actually downloaded COVID-wise. So I don't know if you were involved with that at all or know anything about it.
Yeah, I mean, I do know a bit about it, and I wasn't intimately involved, but I was, from an oversight perspective, I was involved. And really, COVID-wise was more about empowering people, right? And of course, when you talk about being able to implement an exposure notification system like that, one of the biggest things that we as a government organization worry about is the big brother, perspective, right? Or the big brother, thoughts, right? Where people perceive the perception that the state government is going to be monitoring your every move, right? And where you go and what you do and all that wonderful stuff. And the fact is, obviously, we don't care, right? We're not in that space, nor would we be interested in following and tracking anybody. But what we do want to do is be able to provide you with the intelligence you need as an individual to make that determination for yourself, right? So if you did download the COVID-Wise app and you did receive a notification that someone that you were near, for 15 minutes within 6 feet of in the past 2 or 3 days, all of a sudden tested positive, then that empowers you as an individual to make the decision you need to make, whether you need to self-isolate, whether you need to go get tested, whatever it is, right? And what you do with that is up to you. We're not tracking that. That is not to the extent that we want it to go, because at the end of the day, what we really were focused on with COVID-Wise was giving the information to the individual and allow them to make their own decisions, right? And then ultimately, if you got tested, well then, hey, you're going to show up in our testing data because, you just got tested, and that's going to get reported. But if you decided to self-isolate and, and spend the next 14 days at home, like you said, if you're a remote worker and you can do that, but, or you can also self-isolate from your family, right? So, it's things like that we would never know, right? Because no one reports whether or not they self-isolated or not. But it's really about empowering individuals. And that goes back to FACT, right? The Framework for Addiction Analysis and Community Transformation. It isn't about state data or data assets being collected across the Commonwealth to support state work, right? It's about empowering community leaders and individuals within the community where the impact is happening to make the best data-driven, informed decisions that they can, and really empower them. And so that's what all of this is about, is really empowering individuals to make the best decisions and take the best action for themselves. And whether that occurs at the state agency level, that occurs at a community level, or that occurs at the individual level with COVID-wise, you know, and it's funny thing about COVID-wise because, you know, the capability was there, right? To really be a powerful tool for people to use. But, you know, man, people are tricky, you know, and it's hard. And we can have a lot of community outreach and you can have a lot of engagement. But, you know, if people don't see the value of what it is you're trying to do, then they're not going to adopt it. And so that goes back to culture, right? When we talk about data culture, you know, and building those relationships, you know, we all know that Peter Drucker has always said, you know, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? But it also eats technology and innovation for lunch and dinner, right? It doesn't matter how awesome your technology is, or, you know, how innovative your solution is. If people aren't willing to adopt it, it's useless, right? And I'm going to say COVID-wise was completely useless, but I think it falls into that category that if it wasn't widely adopted, you know, how much of an impact did it really have?
Yeah, and also not adopted by the people who would have potentially benefited from it. I mean,
Yeah,
like I'm
yeah,
not,
absolutely.
yeah, like I'm not in favor of Big Brother and stuff, but like I feel like that would have been a particularly useful app, and we went with an opt-in system instead of an opt-out system. Like, I'm guessing just no one in the state government wanted to, you know, take on that risk of making a useful app with an opt-out system and just, you know, let it peter out with a, you know, opt-in system.
Yeah, I mean, believe it or not, when you have, I mean, that's a big nuance, right? And when you, especially when you talk about data privacy, you know, it's you know, not a lot of people are willing to make that judgment call and take on that risk, you know.
Carlos, let's try to wrap up in a couple minutes. We're a little over.
Cool, just a little bit. I mean, I'm okay. So
You're special though, so you know, I don't mind. But yeah.
all right, cool. I mean, yeah, if anybody else has any questions, I'm happy to take them, and let's do one more. How about that?
Sure thing.
Or we can just wrap up.
I was gonna say how are you, but we could also wrap up.
I'll do
Yeah.
well, man.
Yeah, I think that's fine, man. You know, I think everyone knows your email, so you know, if you guys have any other questions, you can probably reach out to Carlos or his team, right?
I'll put it on the chat window. How about that?
Yeah, works for us, man. All right, guys. Well, yeah, Carlos, thank you so much for joining. This has been great. I think, you know, it's always good to have you here and see what your team is up to. I mean, it was a lot of stuff. So, you know, I'll definitely be watching the recording at some point and hopefully have this up, you know, at some point this week. But yeah, thank you so much, Carlos. And, you know, everyone, I hope you guys have a good night. All right.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure, guys. You guys take care. Have a great night.
All right. See you guys.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.